Awesome, okay. I'm Alexandra. I'm a research fellow at Stanford's RegLab, and I'm a computational research scientist there. And today I'll be talking about harnessing AI responsibly with some case studies in computer vision. So I'd like to answer a few questions. Firstly, what is computer vision? You may be acquainted already, but what is it? How is it applied? And what are implications of this technology? Is that level okay? Okay, good. Closer?
Yeah.
Okay, for online. Perfect, I can hear you myself now. Okay, so here are the questions I'd like to address today. So to start with, what is computer vision? Computer vision has a huge market value, evaluated at $20 billion in 2023 and $175 billion in 2032. So it's a ton of wealth there. And what does it look like? So if you present an image to a computer, it could do classification where it sees the image and it tells you that is a cat. Or it could do classification and localization where it says, this is a cat and this is where it is. Or it could do this with multiple objects, or it could do this on the pixel level. So every pixel is assigned a class. So here's a cat, here's a dog, here's a duck. This is pretty spectacular. And kind of amazing how it does that. So to understand how a computer might do this, I think it's useful to look at human vision. So if we look at a beautiful scene like this, how do we see it and how do we recognize what it is? So first you have photons enter your eye. They hit cells at the back of your eye on your retina, and that triggers a neural pathway firing through your brain with different modules that detect different patterns. So can we mimic that with computers? So the computational analog of this would be the input. So instead of photons, we have pixels. So this is an image that's recognizable to us. We can all see, oh, that's a former president. But a computer wouldn't see that. It would see this array of numbers instead. So how can we, looking at this, it's sort of perplexing. How would we ever make sense of this? How would we help a computer understand this image? And to do that, you use an operation called convolution. So I don't know how many people have taken linear algebra, but it's kind of like a dot product. So you have a kernel, which you would sort of multiply across the whole image. It has a specific set of weights, and then you would sum those together in the next layer to sort of propagate that spatial context around that one pixel. So that's sort of our method for telling the computer, okay, this is the pixel, maybe it's the eye, and look around it, it's lighter. So maybe you can learn some sort of patterns from that. So if we repeat that a bunch of times, you would form a convolutional neural network. So here we have input image, a car. It slides through, we repeat the convolution operation through the network. And at the end, we get a classification. Is it a truck, a car, a van, whatever? And you'd use deep learning to update your kernel weights to figure out like the most precise set of numbers that would tell you your convolutional neural network what your input image is based on those matrix weights. So this is classification. That's like when we identified it's a cat. In this case, it's a car. You can also do segmentation. So here we have a really similar idea where you have your input image, you have convolutions, but instead of just going down to one like singular weight, you explode it back up such that you have the same number of pixels at the end. And then you can predict a class for each pixel. So this is segmentation. So what are applications? The previous talk did a really, wonderful job in introducing all of the ways that AI will impact society. So this is just computer vision, but it does impact healthcare, agriculture, law enforcement, retail sports, scientific research, and environmental monitoring. So here are some visualizations of how this would be used in society. So you could see, oh, there's a crate that's being detected in a factory, or it's detecting a human's body position. There's so many examples of how you'd use computer vision in society. So I'll go over a few of them. This one is very dear to my heart. This is about my research at the RegLab, in which we monitor concentrated animal feeding operations. And I'll refer to this as CAFOs. So a CAFO, it's a bunch of animals living in a factory farm. So you see the top picture, that's a bunch of pigs living indoors. And the bottom picture is an aerial shot of one of these facilities. So you can see the big buildings, that's where the animals are housed. And those red blobs next to them, that's lagoons. And that's where the waste is stored from the animals. So to motivate this project, I want to explain why we care about CAFOs and why we want to monitor them. So they have a really huge environmental impact. US livestock produces 1.37 billion tons of waste a year. And embarrassingly, that's 3 to 20 times more waste than humans produce. It's incredible, so much. And it's really poorly managed. Secondly, their waste and their digestion produce a ton of methane. Methane is a really, really powerful greenhouse gas, and its global warming impact is 28 to 34 times that of carbon dioxide. So taken all together, CAFOs produce more than 7% of greenhouse gases in the US. So getting a handle on these emissions is really key to solving climate change. And lastly, I talked about the immense amounts of manure. It's really poorly regulated, and the manure also contains bacteria, hormones, antibiotics, trace elements, and a bunch of other organic material that, when it gets into waterways, really severely impacts public health and also disrupts ecosystems, causing algal blooms, oxygen depletion in waterways. It's really nasty. So what does the US have at present to take care of this environmental impact? There are regulations, there are water permits. It's a little bit cut off, but of the 28,000 CAFOs nationwide, only about 23% have these water pollution permits. And these are permits that will put limits on the type of pollution, where they can pollute and how much in waterways. And here's a sort of a motivating picture. I think it's a hog CAFO in North Carolina that's draining into a lagoon. So you can see it's a real issue. And currently, methane emissions and other air pollution is unregulated. And there's no federal agency that collects accurate and consistent data on the number, the size, and the location of these CAFOs. So to me, a big problem is being presented. So before I introduce our full project, I want to introduce one other player, and that is satellite imagery. So there's many public data sets of really high pixel resolution satellite imagery. And these data sets capture multiple bands, so you can get optical imagery, but you can also get thermal imagery and other signatures like methane detection from these satellite images. The issue, though, is that we have a huge world, and a human analyst cannot accurately annotate all of the imagery that comes in a day. So perhaps there's an application of artificial intelligence. So that's exactly what we did. We took satellite imagery, we trained a segmentation model, and we also took human annotations of barns in order to train the model to identify these animal feeding facilities from the satellite imagery. So once we trained the model and we were happy with its abilities, we got these individual polygons, these predictions from the model. And then we had to go from individual polygon to a clustered facility using context like the land parcel and other contextual information around there. Once we had the facility, we could then do sort of a back of the envelope estimate of, based on this much area, it has between X and Y numbers of animals to give us a good range of how many animals could be there. And then we checked the methane that those animals would produce. We also checked these against permits, identifying novel or like unpermitted CAFOs that should have permits. So unfortunately, the data is being processed and the papers are being written. So I would love to share with you guys the papers, but I can show you a model prediction, which I think is pretty interesting. So you can see here's a human annotation and there's the model prediction. And you can see it does a pretty great job at capturing these. And when we compared our animal count estimates to those listed on permitted facilities, they align really closely. So I'm very excited, and the paper will be out soon. So the next application is not my own work, but I think it's really fascinating as well. So I mentioned that some satellites can also capture other bands in addition to optical imagery, like they can capture or identify methane. So they're in areas where natural gas is being mined or transported. But during that process, it's a gas and it's also invisible. So if there's a leak, we won't know about it for a long time, and we'll be releasing this really, really powerful greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. So obviously something we'd like to avoid. So you can use satellite imagery that detects methane and stop these leaks before too much of an environmental impact has been caused. Another really interesting application is also not my work, but really, really interesting. It's monitoring nuclear facilities. This was done by a group at Stanford. And they are specialists in political science and nuclear facilities. And they were able to use optical satellite imagery and thermal satellite imagery to monitor the locations of the facilities, as well as the number of cars, the number of ships visiting the facility that would indicate when it's being active and for what uses it might be used for. And they also included thermal imagery to see the heat that was dissipating into the water, which would give them an insight to what's happening internationally with other nuclear facilities. So I think these 3 examples raise a lot of questions. For my own project and for many of these, the model was open sourced. We just fine-tuned it. The satellite imagery was also open sourced. So together, the model plus this imagery allows such incredible capabilities. but also raises questions, right? How do we validate and maintain trust in these model predictions? How do we make sure that our training data is unbiased? And how do we balance safety and regulation with helpful innovation? And I haven't even touched on generative models that are all the rage, but with these new capabilities, how do we maintain a clear understanding of true versus fabricated images? And lastly, more broadly, when using AI, how do we consider all those unseen elements, like the raw materials that went into the computers, or the energy that was necessary to run training and inference? So just as we increase our reliance upon AI and these technologies, our compute will go up and our energy demands will go up. So I think it's really important to think about these and how can we consider alternative methods that are more energy efficient. So that is my talk for today. Thank you so much for listening. It's such an amazing opportunity, and I welcome any questions.
So thank you very much. Your last bullet just motivated me to ask this question because there was a news section on PBS recently about the energy required to run these models and training. And we're talking about big, big facilities and a lot of compute power and lots of almost drawing powers to the scale of what is usually consumed by cities. So do you have some ideas, some solutions, some predictions on how to tackle the issue of efficiency?
Yeah, well, I think this is a really great foreshadowing for the next presentation. But I think there are really interesting methods with using kind of physical properties of materials to rethink how we do compute, which I don't want to give away anything. And I'm also no expert, but I think there are possibilities, and I'll leave it to Sophie to field that question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again. Yeah. At the beginning, you spoke about basics of the convolutional networks, right? How I see convolutional networks is basically a representation that helps the machine learning algorithm to understand that what is shown to it is an actual and two-dimensional image, right? So it's basically a method to represent a two-dimensional image for the machine learning algorithm. So I've had this basic question for quite a long. Do you think, or do you know any kind of research that shows that modern attention techniques and transformers can actually learn this representational layer by their own, so that we're not limited to two-dimensional images, maybe like three-dimensional or n-dimensional images, or any infinite dimensional things, markets, financial markets in general could be multi-dimensional images that this network can learn?
Great question. I would say the answer is yes. First, maybe just a small caveat, even for these two-dimensional images, they have usually at least 3 bands of color. Maybe they'll have another band. For my project, we had 4 bands, the near-infrared signal. So the convolutional neural network operates on more than a really two-dimensional input. And then that can be extended to time series data, like videos, like transformers. So I would say that, yes, there are so many really, really cool, really creative, different techniques to process all sorts of data, from neural processing, like your brain's data, or market data, videos, all sorts of things. So yes.
Cool. So you mentioned about part of the challenge is finding good data and trying to make sure that the data is accurate, and in order to increase quality and reduce the bias. Yeah. So without asking how to solve this from a general perspective, what did you end up doing for your project, considering the data that you have doesn't come with a nice labeled set that you can say that this is accurate? Like you ended up doing something new that ended up having to produce this information so you can get quality information. So what steps did you end up taking to solve that issue?
Yeah, great question. And it's super, super important, as you note, about validating your model's predictions. We did a lot of human annotation. We hired a third party of human labelers to go over all of the model predictions. So in this case, we don't want to send the EPA to a little farmer or a house even that's not a farm without really thoroughly validating. So we relied on human annotations for our case. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Did you create your own LLM, large language model, and then was it based on, where'd you get the data from?
Yeah, great question. So we used a convolutional neural network called a UNet. Looks like, okay, the model architecture is like this. And there are sort of pre-trained weights that you could use online and then fine tune in a process called transfer learning. So that is what we did. We took a UNet segmentation model. We used the kind of standard weights for this model. And then we obtained a lot of those, both in the training and the validation. We got human labels of just shapes around the barns. And then we used satellite imagery, the National Agriculture, something called NAPE imagery, that's open source.
Either NOAA or EPA or something like
NAPE, yeah,
Okay,
definitely.
Okay.
Good question.
So the reason you picked animal waste, is it because 23% is regulated by EPA? Only 23%? Is that right? Is that why?
Yes, it seems like there is this gap between where the CAFOs are and what we know of them. And it's easy to sort of, there's some nuances I didn't add, like the type of permit, that's the water permit. You have to be a certain size of animal feeding operation in order to be required to have one of those. So one of the projects was actually identifying these facilities and then seeing, hey, you were reporting, you're like, you have 1,000 cows, but it looks like you have the space for 20,000 cows. I mean, these are just crazy numbers, but that was one of the questions. Yeah.
Yeah, the reason why I asked that is because if you look at oil and gas,
Mhm.
right, they produce a whole lot more methane than animal. So just curious.
Yeah, no, it's also just that it's for water purposes.
Yeah.
Most predominantly in the US, we don't actually do any sort of methane or air pollution regulation for animal feeding operations. I think in other countries, I don't know the specifics, but in Denmark, they're putting a tax on cows because of their methane impact, but it's not something we currently do. Yeah,
Yeah. Thanks, Alexandra.
awesome.
Thank you so much.